The first thing you notice is not the shape nor the sound. It is the scars. It was meant to bring its pilots home. But victory came with the cost he never expected. Pulling away from the valley floor, Canario misjudged his angle by a fraction of a second. A factory chimney, thin, gray, almost invisible against the winter haze, appeared directly in front of him. The P-47 clipped it with a brutal metallic crack. The impact tore one-third of the right wing clean off. The fighter lurched violently sideways, almost rolling inverted. For a moment, the cockpit filled with the sickening silence of a machine that should not be flying. But the Thunderbolt did not fall. Despite the missing wing section, despite the structural damage, despite the asymmetric lift trying to spin it into the earth, the P-47 held together. Canario fought the trembling controls, coaxing the aircraft into a barely stable glide. And to understand why this unlikely Titan became a legend, you must step into the smoke-filled cockpit, where fire licked the canopy, where a pilot fought for breath, and where a machine proved that survival, pure, stubborn survival, could be a weapon of its own. Each mile back toward friendly lines felt like an eternity, the airframe groaning with every shift of wind. Yet the Jug endured. It survived enemy fire, the impact of a collision that should have ripped it apart, and the desperation of a pilot wrestling physics itself. When Canario finally brought the wounded fighter down for an emergency landing, the ground crew stared in disbelief. No one had ever seen a P-47 fly or live under such conditions. The legend grew again. The Thunderbolt could survive the enemy. It could survive fire. And astonishingly, it could survive its own pilot's mistakes. While the Thunderbolt was proving its strength over Europe and Italy, a very different challenge was unfolding across the Pacific. There, the battlefield was made not of valleys or cities, but of oceans, vast distances that swallowed aircraft whole. Now let's return to the moment the legend was forged. The United States needed fighters that could escort B-29 superfortresses, protect island outposts, and fly missions far beyond the reach of earlier P-47 models. The war against Japan demanded endurance on a scale no Western fighter had yet achieved. This strategic pressure reshaped the Thunderbolt once more. Engineers returned to the drawing board and emerged with the P-47N, a long-range variant built for the Pacific's immense geography. Its wings were stretched by 18 inches, not for agility, but for fuel, an additional 100 gallons stored inside the structure, raising its total capacity to an astonishing 990 gallons. With these changes, the Thunderbolt extended its combat radius to over 175 miles, a distance that transformed it from a battlefield brawler into a true strategic escort. But the improvements were not only in fuel. A more powerful R-2800 engine, updated ignition systems, and an autopilot designed to reduce pilot fatigue meant the P-47N could endure missions lasting many hours. For American planners, it was a symbol of adaptation, the industrial ability to redesign, retool, and redeploy without pausing the war effort. In contrast, Japan, struggling under resource shortages and blockades, could not match such rapid evolution. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt begins not with glory, but with a problem. The P-47N became another example of how industrial strength shapes strategic outcomes. Its moment in history came on August 8, 1945, during the Thunderbolt's only B-29 escort mission of the war. 160 P-47Ns rose from island airfields to guard 245 superfortresses on their way to strike Iwata, Japan. It was a final demonstration of America's long-range air power, a preview of what the post-war world would come to understand and reach as a form of dominance. Could now project air superiority over distances that once seemed impossible. And for the pilots who flew them, the message was clear. A fighter that had survived Europe's cannons and Italy's flak had now grown into a machine capable of shaping strategy across entire oceans. The P-47 was no longer just a battlefield survivor. It had become a global instrument of air power. In the final years of the war, as the smoke of Europe and the Pacific slowly began to clear, one truth remained unmistakable. The P-47 Thunderbolt was more than a machine. By 1941, the United States needed a fighter that could climb high, fight hard, and survived long enough to escort heavy bombers deep into enemy territory. It was a statement of industrial might, of engineering philosophy, and of the quiet, unwavering determination of the men who flew it. More than 15,600 airframes rolled out of American factories, each one a testament to a nation that believed durability was not a luxury in war, but a necessity for survival. Across continents, the Thunderbolt carved its legend in different ways. For Robert S. Johnson, it was a lifeline, an armored cocoon that returned him to safety when every law of physics and probability said he should have died. For Renro Canario, it was strength, raw, unyielding strength that carried him through fire, flak, and even a catastrophic mid-air collision to a landing that should never have been possible. And in the vast Pacific, the P-47N stretched its wings across distances no earlier fighter dared attempt, proving that American air power could reach across oceans and still arrive with force. Together, these stories form a single truth. The Thunderbolt was built to endure. It endured the enemy. It endured the battlefield. European skies were becoming slaughterhouses, and the thin-skinned fighters of the early war were falling too quickly to German cannon fire. And it endured the fragile human hands that depended on it. Even now, more than 80 years later, the silhouette of the P-47 against a setting sky evokes not just nostalgia, but respect, a reminder that survival itself can be heroic. Its fuselage, thick and scarred, reflects a generation that learned the cost of freedom and carried that weight without complaint. As you watch this story fade into the quiet of history, a question lingers. Which moment from the Thunderbolt's long journey speaks to you the most? The fire over France, the tigers in Italy, or the long Pacific horizon? Share your thoughts below. Every story adds meaning to the legacy. And if you wish to continue exploring the battles, decisions, and machines that shaped our world, stay with us. The war may have ended, but history is still being written, one story at a time. Republic Aviation's answer was not subtle. It was a machine built around one of the most powerful engines of its era, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radio that shook the ground whenever its propellers came alive. Engineers wrapped that engine in an armored cowling, strapped 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns to its wings, and mounted it on an airframe so thick and so heavily braced that some pilots joked it was too much airplane for one man. But the design had a purpose. The Thunderbolt's massive size allowed it to dive faster than almost any fighter in the war, absorbing the stress that would rip lighter aircraft apart. A fighter crawling through the sky, its skin torn open by cannon shells, its frame trembling under the weight of fire and steel. Its rugged frame could take hits to the fuel lines, wings, and control surfaces, hits that would instantly kill a Spitfire or Bf-109 and still remain in the air. On paper, it was a high-altitude escort fighter. In the field, it became something more. Combat changed everything. Once deployed over Europe, pilots realized the P-47's weight was not a burden. It was a weapon. Its speed in a dive, its armor, and its 8 heavy guns made it devastating in ground attack missions. The Thunderbolt could drop bombs, launch rockets, and rake enemy columns with thousands of rounds, all while surviving the dense curtain of flak that guarded German positions. And so the aircraft's identity shifted. What began as a high-altitude guardian slowly transformed into the Allied hammer on the ground. It was not the most agile fighter. And yet, it refuses to fall. It did not turn tightly or dance through the air like its British cousins. But when the mission demanded endurance, when pilots needed a machine that could plunge into a battlefield and come back through fire, the Thunderbolt became irreplaceable. Yet even this reputation, carved from sorties and steel, was only the beginning. For the world to truly understand what the P-47 could survive, it would take a single pilot alone over enemy territory, fighting a burning cockpit, failing controls, and the guns of an ace determined to kill him. That moment arrived on June 26, 1943, high above occupied France, when Robert S. Johnson found himself trapped inside a falling, burning Thunderbolt that refused to die. The morning of June 26, 1943, should have been routine. Robert S. Johnson, young, determined, and barely seasoned, flew his P-47C in formation, escorting B-17 bombers back across the gray skies of occupied France. The clouds below hid towns scarred by occupation. In the brutal arena of World War II air combat, where speed and elegance ruled the day, one machine broke every rule ever written. The silence inside his cockpit was broken only by engine vibration and the soft hiss of oxygen flow. Nothing hinted that disaster was already diving toward him. It began with a flash, sunlight glinting off metal. 16 Focke-Wulf W190s dropped out of the sky in a perfect predatory sweep. "Bandits, 5 o'clock," Johnson shouted, but his radio, already unreliable, choked into static. His warning never reached the others. The first shells hit before he could maneuver. Cannon fire shattered the canopy. Shards of glass tore into his flight suit. A 21mm round ruptured his oxygen line. Another punctured the hydraulic system. They called it the jug. Oil and oxygen mixed in the torn cockpit and ignited. Flames curled around Johnson's legs and arms, licking upward in violent bursts. His world narrowed to heat, pain, and the violent twisting of a fighter falling into a death spiral. He fought the controls with burned hands. The Thunderbolt spun, dove, shuddered, then somehow stabilized. Johnson could barely see. Hydraulic fluid blurred his vision, but the engine still roared, steady and unbroken. The airplane, even soaked in fire and pierced by metal, refused to surrender. But the fight was far from over. A lone W W2 peeled away from the German formation and turned toward the wounded P-47. Its bright yellow nose marked the pilot, Egon Meyer, one of the Luftwaffe's most feared aces and a specialist in hunting Thunderbolts. Others called it the flying tank. Meyer closed in with clinical precision, his 20mm cannons hammering Johnson's aircraft once more. When the smoke cleared, Meyer pulled alongside, close enough for Johnson to see the ace's face. Meyer raised his wings in a crisp military salute. It was not mercy. It was mockery, a gesture reserved for a defeated opponent who would not survive the next pass. Then Meyer wheeled around and came again. With his heavy cannons empty, the ace switched to 7 92mm machine guns, stitching hundreds of rounds into the Thunderbolt's fuselage, wings, and tail. Johnson ducked behind his armored seat, bracing for the impact that never came. The P-47 absorbed the punishment, metal buckling but not breaking, systems failing but not dying. When Meyer finally broke off, out of ammunition and perhaps out of disbelief, Johnson found himself alone in the sky. It was heavy, stubborn, oversized, an insult, some pilots joked, to the idea of a fighter. But beneath that rugged shell lived something different. Alone but alive, he coaxed the crippled fighter across the channel and lowered it onto the runway in a rough, trembling landing. Ground crews counted more than 200 bullet holes, multiple cannon strikes, shredded control surfaces, yet the aircraft stood upright, engine still running. On that day, the legend hardened into truth. The Thunderbolt might be wounded, it might be burning, but destroying it was something else entirely. By early 1945, a different battlefield awaited the Thunderbolt, one carved not in clouds, but in mountains and valleys. The Apennines of northern Italy were cold, jagged, and unforgiving. German armor hid among villages and ridgelines, and every road was a corridor of ambushes. Here, altitude no longer mattered. Something nearly impossible to kill. Survival meant descending into the teeth of flak, and no aircraft did it better than the P-47. Among the pilots flying these dangerous missions was an 18-year-old Brazilian aviator, Renro Canario, known to his squadron as Canary. Young, fearless, and still learning the weight of war, he flew with the Brazilian Expeditionary Force attached to the U-3 Fighter Group. On January 27, 1945, Canario lifted off into pale winter light, unaware that his day would become one of the most astonishing tests of Thunderbolt durability ever recorded. It began with a sight no pilot wanted to see. Below, winding through a valley road, was a German armored column, and at its center, 2 Tiger tanks, the heaviest and most feared machines on the European front. Pilots were warned repeatedly, Do not attack Tigers unless absolutely necessary. Their armor shrugged off small caliber rounds, and the flak batteries that traveled with them were merciless.
Canario dove anyway.
With an 18-cylinder Double Wasp engine roaring in front of the cockpit and 8 50 caliber guns lining its wings, the P-47 Thunderbolt was never meant to be graceful. His P-47 screamed downward in a steep attack run, the airframe rattling as 8 50 caliber guns unleashed a river of fire. Rockets streaked ahead of him, erupting against the Tiger's hulls with violent bursts of flame.
The valley lit up under the barrage.
One Tiger burned,
Then the second.
Shouts filled the radio as German gunners recovered and swung their 20mm cannons toward the sky. Black puffs of flak blossomed around the Thunderbolt. Canario felt the aircraft jolt as shrapnel tore across its wings and tail. Still, he pressed the attack, targeting a third armored vehicle. Another dive, another rocket strike, another explosion.